It's the holiday season, Christmas and Kwanzaa are coming up, Hanukkah just ended, you're probably enjoying time off school or stressing about having to deal with your family or both. So what better time to watch Cartoon Conspiracy and hurl ourselves into an existential crisis revolving around talking animals? Let's go! That was a lot more aggressive than I meant for it to be on paper. Yes, today on Cartoon Conspiracy, we're gonna be talking about the sad horse show, Bojack Horseman, for the first and hopefully not last time. There aren't many other shows on right now that have been able to so perfectly portray the human experience, and particularly the difficulties of the search for meaning. And if you've never seen the show before and you're wondering where this is all coming from, yes, it's that Bojack Horseman, the one that you keep scrolling past on Netflix. Go watch all 5 seasons right now. It's seriously one of the best shows on television. While we're pretty familiar with Bojack's brand of binge drinking just to get through the day, there's always someone else acting as a twisted mirror for him to peer into, that being his overly enthusiastic rival, Mr. Peanutbutter. While these two characters seem like complete opposites of each other, there is a theory that the show's endgame is gonna flip the script with these two to prove a point about the search for happiness. I'm Jacob with Channel Frederator, and to keep it short, will Bojack Horseman come full circle with Mr. Peanutbutter ending up like Bojack? By the way, this video is gonna have some season 5 spoilers for Bojack Horseman, so you might wanna go watch that before continuing with this video, but you know, just like pause this one or put it in your watch later playlist or something. I'll be here when you get back. Bojack Horseman makes it no secret that our equine protagonist and our canine foil have a lot in common. Back in the 90s, both Bojack Horseman and Mr. Peanutbutter were both in very famous TV shows, Horsing Around and Mr. Peanutbutter's House. I'll leave it to you to figure out who was in which one. Both shows were cliche 90s sitcom fare that would even make the producers of Full House stop and say, man, these shows are kinda schmaltzy. Bojack Horseman, though, picks up in the mid-2010s, well after the time that these shows had in the spotlight. And we follow the life of Bojack as he tries to stay relevant and maintain purpose after riding the highest highs of TV fame 2 decades ago. And being ratings rivals of the time, it's no surprise that Bojack has maintained a grudging relationship with Mr. Peanutbutter, who on the surface appears to be faring much better than Bojack, stumbling into love and success while Bojack continuously struggles with crippling loneliness and substance abuse. But apart from having both starred on incredibly popular and incredibly similar sitcoms, one of the things that makes Bojack and Mr. Peanutbutter so alike is that they're both driven by the same philosophy. Where they differ the most is how they choose to cope with it, as that ever-present mindset is that of nihilism. The belief that all things, religion, morals, humans, creepy Sonic the Hedgehog posters, all exist without meaning or purpose. In the words of Russian author Leo Tolstoy, the only absolute knowledge attainable by man is that life is meaningless. And while this outlook can seem bleak at first glance, there are several ways to interpret this thinking. But to stick with that bleak feeling, Bojack himself is the embodiment of existential nihilism. He drinks himself into stupors and wallows around in an ongoing existential crisis, being plagued by things like anxiety and self-doubt. And it's precisely because of this anxiety that Bojack feels pressure to find meaning in a universe that he views as bleak and uncompromising. Having the ability to forge a path but without any certainty or guidance of whether he's doing the right thing paralyzes him. After all, there's nothing Bojack hates more than being responsible for his own actions.
I am asking to be held accountable.
And I'm telling you, it's not gonna happen.
And by having this responsibility to be able to do whatever he wants, whether he likes it or not, he lives in a prison of his own freedom, to paraphrase a certain French existentialist philosopher. It's Jean-Paul Sartre. I don't know why I'm being mysterious about it. Mr. Peanutbutter, on the other hand, is an outgoing, extroverted, literal party animal who always seems to have something going on, but that's because he doesn't get hung up on the day-to-day existential nightmare that Bojack lives through. Contrary to Bojack, instead of resisting life at every turn, Mr. Peanutbutter tends to lean into the meaninglessness of life, but I'll let him tell it.
The universe is a cruel, uncaring void. The key to being happy isn't to search for meaning, it's to just keep yourself busy with unimportant nonsense, and eventually you'll be dead.
This is more the speed of optimistic nihilism, or even absurdism, which is an idea that was written about extensively by French philosopher Albert Camus. It's basically the idea that any pursuit of meaning is in itself nullified with our eventual deaths, which basically rends all of existence meaningless. And it's this juxtaposition that our minds, which so desire purpose and closure, they're just not compatible with the universe that we occupy, and it's absurd. And Mr. Peanutbutter's response to this mindset is basically, screw it, let's roll with it. Both Bojack and Mr. Peanutbutter live by the words, nothing in the world matters. The difference is that Bojack says it while watching old tapes of horsing around and day drinking 8 days a week, while Mr. Peanutbutter says it while skateboarding over an erupting volcano. Also the difference between millennials and Gen Zs. Mr. Peanutbutter's role through most of the show supports this mindset. Whenever we check in with him, he's generally getting into some stupid scheme with Todd. And what are stupid schemes with Todd but unimportant nonsense to keep yourself busy with, at least from Mr. Peanutbutter's perspective? Halloween store in January didn't work out? Why not get involved in a burgeoning clown dentistry business, or run for governor of California, or I don't know, something involving spaghetti strainers. And through this, Mr. Peanutbutter has even developed a pretty darn likable public persona, unlike some of his more cantankerous contemporaries. So with everything I've said so far, it sounds like Mr. Peanutbutter's attempts of coping with the existential nightmare of nihilism is the objectively healthier way when comparing him to Bojack. So how could you suggest that he's so similar to Bojack that by the end of the series, he might be moving into Bojack's old place in Rock Bottom? Bojack's lifestyle of anxiety and self-doubt is not a healthy approach. We know that, and he knows that. But on the other hand, skateboarding over an active volcano isn't without its own set of risks. Both of these lifestyles can be self-destructive in their own way, and we're starting to see this with Mr. Peanutbutter's laid-back approach to his own existence. Remember that scene we showed earlier where Mr. Peanutbutter basically lays out his entire philosophy to Diane? The context of that scene is that she's considering an offer from a celebrity philanthropist to write about his philanthropic adventures and stuff, you know, aiding communities all around the world. But Mr. Peanutbutter sees it as Diane just wanting to do something, anything. And from his perspective at least, he wasn't entirely wrong. Diane turns the position down after being offered a job closer to home, putting off the work that really matters to the nebulous later, which is coincidentally when I write all these scripts. I mention this scene specifically because it serves as a kind of microcosm to how Mr. Peanutbutter deals with any problem or confrontation in his life. Sidestep it, sweep it under the rug, get back to distractions. And this can be observed in not just Diane, but all of his ex-wives. And it's here we start to see the cracks in his facade and really understand his flaws. You know, his flaws other than being overly trusting and kind of dumb. Mr. Peanutbutter isn't exactly a swing and free spirit. He's always prepared to give himself completely to whichever wife he happens to be married to at the moment. And so long as he's happy, or at least his version of happy, he'll stay with them until something changes. Spoiler alert, it's never him that changes. But hey, whatever, get divorced, get a new wife, get back to distractions. And by the time we meet him in the series, he's dating the woman who becomes his third wife, so let's talk about him and Diane. One of the defining moments of their relationship, in that it's what basically ended their relationship, is that of the library fight. This is one of the most divisive arguments I've ever seen when it comes to who was in the wrong. This is were Ross and Rachel on a break levels of polarizing. The context is that Diane tells Mr. Peanutbutter in confidence that she always had a fantasy of having a giant library like Belle in Beauty and the Beast, calling it a bell room to make it feel like something she could claim ownership of. But when they move into their new place, Mr. Peanutbutter just gives her one. And Diane's response isn't what he was expecting. Being someone who historically doesn't like grand gestures, as well as somebody who believes in the importance of maintaining a life outside of her husband, Diane completely shuts down, not knowing how to take this gift from Mr. Peanutbutter. Now, obviously Mr. Peanutbutter was acting with good intentions, but Diane's unappreciative response drives a wedge between the two. Diane doesn't know how to process it because she knows that he meant well, but she's frustrated because he not only chose to ignore the fact that she hates grand gestures, but he did it in a way that usurped something that was uniquely hers, something that she could call her own, because now it's just another one of those things that Mr. Peanutbutter did. Mr. Peanutbutter comes back by saying that he built this because he wanted Diane to feel like she was at home in this place. He wanted it to be their house, which is fine. I respect that. But on the other hand, he also seems to view Diane's fantasy that she cherishes as just another thing to occupy herself with to avoid that existential void we all fall into when we can't sleep at night. And you could also make the argument that Mr. Peanutbutter building Diane a bell room in the first place is yet another one of Mr. Peanutbutter's things to distract him, which would at its core make this a more selfish act. Moreover, he reveals part of his reasoning for the act is because he's afraid that Diane will get bored of him, further showing that in his mind the average person will likely settle for the short gain rather than work hard to build something that lasts, which is also something he projects onto his other ex-wives. And this leads us gracefully into Season 5's Mr. Peanutbutter's Booze, in which he takes his new squeeze Pickles to Bojack's 25th annual Halloween party that he never wants to throw. But we also see parallels of all of Mr. Peanutbutter's previous relationships with his girlfriends and wives, and specifically how they all went south. And in the episode, he finally realizes something that Bojack learned a long time ago. If everywhere you go smells like shit, you might want to consider looking under your shoe. Or at least he comes close to understanding that. Though while Bojack is all too prepared to live with that appraisal of himself, oftentimes doing nothing and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, Mr. Peanutbutter goes through some mental gymnastics in order to avoid admitting he has any faults. And it's not until Diane confronts him that he begins to take it to heart. Diane, now one of Mr. Peanutbutter's ex-wives by the time of this episode, she diagnoses the problem pretty easily. His wives keep growing up, and mentally he stays the same age. Cue Matthew McConaughey in Dazed and Confused joke.
All right. Right.
And now we can move on. To solve this problem, Diane either suggests dating closer to his age or putting more time and effort into changing himself and growing up. And he's not particularly jazzed about either solution in the moment. But later, when it looks like he might actually try to apply Diane's advice, he realizes too late that Pickles is once again too young for him and won't respond to Mr. Peanut Butter's attempts to grow up. He can't expect her to grow up when he's got a good 20 years on her at least. Some infidelity with Diane here, some soul-crushing guilt there, and before you know it, just as Mr. Peanut Butter's about to do the right thing for once and hold himself accountable for his actions by confessing to Pickles, he can't go through with it. Look at him go, down on one knee, and he's engaged for a fourth time. Bit of an extreme course correction. Sweep it under the rug, get married again, get back to distractions. I think somebody might need to teach Mr. Peanut Butter the definition of insanity. All this to say that Mr. Peanut Butter's current situation with his latest wedding proposal and everything that he's done up until the end of season 5 has been the result of him gliding down the path of least resistance rather than confronting his problems. Bojack may torture himself and others as he searches for meaning, whether it's being an actor, a good brother, a good friend, or none of these things, but Mr. Peanut Butter's outright rejection of this pursuit and consequently any sense of meaning is driving him down his own destructive path. And just as one last quick example of this mindset, look at the season 3 episode Old Acquaintance, when Captain Peanut Butter, Mr. Peanut Butter's brother, says that he has a twisted spleen and that Mr. Peanut Butter might have to one day be the captain. His response?
What is this? A very special episode?
A cheesy joke befitting of his phony Hollywood persona to diffuse the situation rather than confront it. That's not indicative of anything on its own. I do the same thing in stressful situations. But comparing it to all of his other behaviors, it's incredibly telling that he can't even be himself in front of his own family. Mr. Peanut Butter and Bojack forever remaining diametrically opposed is an intriguing idea. But for a show who focuses so much on the truth that there's no greater meaning to the universe, it feels too perfect. And the idea of the show coming full circle and Mr. Peanut Butter ending up like Bojack and vice versa kind of presupposes the idea that Mr. Peanut Butter is a happy person. Mr. Peanut Butter is very clearly unfulfilled in his own way, just like Bojack and everyone else in the show, whether he's prepared to admit it or continue to hide behind his optimistic nihilism as a crutch. Bojack might be going to rehab and Mr. Peanut Butter may be continuing to make just horrible impulsive decisions, but just because Bojack's taken a step forward and Mr. Peanut Butter a step back in the latest season, I don't think we'll see him become the same type of binge-drinking, substance-abusing person that Bojack is. We all have our different vices, and as the show is apt to tell us, there is no right path towards happiness because happiness isn't guaranteed. And in that sense, you almost can't predict the narrative of Bojack Horseman like you could for most other shows. We all live in this world our own way, and we all cope with it our own way. So with all of this in mind, on the plausibility meter, I'm going to rate the conspiracy of Bojack Horseman potentially coming full circle, 2 symbols of Bojack's inability to distance his self-worth from his work as well as his resistance to face himself out of 5. I mean, balloons, they're They're balloons. But that's just me. Bojack is a pretty abstract show that revels in discussion, so do you think that Mr. Peanut Butter is setting himself up for a huge fall? Or do you think that his optimistic nihilism will ensure that everything will turn out all right-ish for him? Let us know in the comments, and of course, don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. Once again, I'm Jacob, and never forget, Frederator loves you. And hey, if you want to break from the absurd world that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, maybe for the end of the year, consider taking Mr. Peanut Butter's advice of just rolling with it, in moderation. But yeah, happy holidays.